Welcome to Joey Jackson on the Law. Welcome to Joey Jackson on the Law. And today I want to talk to you about a number of things, but primarily I want to talk to you about Black and brown people being under attack. Seemingly, we are living in some strange times. Now, let me start here. If you look at the issue of certainly universities, you look at how universities cannot take, by virtue of the Supreme Court, race into consideration with respect to admissions decisions. That obviously has had an impact in terms of the enrollment in schools. If you look at the issue of corporate America, how there's an attack upon diversity, equity, and inclusion. That used to be a good word, diversity, equity, inclusion. We are a country that is diverse, that is inclusive, or so I thought. And that was equitable. I thought that too. And so certainly there's a major impact as it relates not only to universities and who they're accepting and the impact it's having on Black and brown people in attending these universities, particularly prestigious ones. Not that all universities aren't prestigious in their mission to educate, to uplift, and to serve. But you look at corporate America and this attack upon diversity, equity, inclusion as if it were a four-letter word. It's three initials or one initial with three different symbols. And so the fact is that where are we going and what are we doing? And then if you look at the latest Supreme Court doing relating to voting rights and what it says about voting rights, cannot take race into account, right? You got to show intentional discrimination. Guess what? People are very, very clever and unique and creative with respect to how things are masked. So you can actually create something or do something like drawing a map that has an effect on discriminating. But if you establish that it wasn't intentional, or you can show that it related to just partisan politics, there's nothing to see here. So it's very problematic with regard to, I've given you those three examples: higher education, corporate America, and voting. Why is voting important? Well, it has a little something to do with people in power. It has something to do with the policies that are pursued by those people in power, the nature of the governmental contracts that they have to dole out, which leads to economic empowerment, which leads to empowering communities or disenfranchising communities. So it has a lot to do with everything. But what I want to do is I want to break it down and go into a historical perspective about this. We're going to do this in pieces. And the first piece I wanted to do is I wanted to go back. I wanted to go back, 150 years or so, maybe 160. And I wanted to go back to actually the Civil War. You remember that, right? The Civil War. And in the Civil War, you had a major fight. And what was the fight about? The fight was about whether or not there would be slavery or there would not be slavery. And you remember the context it was, right? When I talk about a long time ago, 1861 to 1865. And you had the North and you had the South, right? And you had these battle clashes with regard to what is America going to look like, right? Where are we going to go? Is it going to be slavery that is going to rule the roost? Are we going to continue to treat Black and brown people like chattel and property? Are we going to actually emancipate and free Black and brown people so that they can live their lives in dignity and uplift themselves by the bootstraps so that they could become well-meaning people in society, having their own economic power, strength, etc. So I decided to look at a few things. And what I decided to look at is to do a deep dive, not about the Civil War, but history is really important. We know what happened in the Civil War. We know who was victorious in the Civil War. We know that slavery is no longer, but we also know the toll it took on a country in terms of the division of North and South. We know the toll it took with regard to people fighting for rights and freedoms, and my ancestors certainly having a lot to do with it. But I wanted to look at the different amendments. There were really three different amendments that came out of and that resulted from the fierce fight. And the reason I wanted to go back to that is because I look at present day and I look at, yes, people of color having vast amount of opportunities, doing well in various communities, but I can't stop but think that there's this attack, that there's this shift, that there's this mood, that there's this air, that there's this distinction about how things were just a short time ago to where they're leading. And I can't say that it pleases me. And so I wanted to first look at the 13th Amendment. And what is that 13th Amendment? Well, let's talk about that. Let's go back to 1865. And let's go back to the issues that I just talked about in terms of the civil rights and whether there should be slavery or whether there should not. The battle clash between whether it was proper or appropriate. Now, we know people love their money, and we obviously know that it was free labor, but is it moral or was it reprehensible? Is it the right thing to do or was it the absolute wrong thing to do? Well, history has raised that question. But in talking about the actual 13th Amendment in 1865, which officially abolished slavery, I wanted to talk about it in the context of not only what it did, but what it resulted in, right? You had this 13th Amendment, which was the abolition of slavery. And yes, of course, you had Abraham Lincoln. He was a president at the time, the Emancipation Proclamation. But that only related to the emancipation of Confederate. Remember Confederate, the Confederacy of the South? Those were those who wanted slavery versus the Union soldiers of the North who didn't. But then you had, by virtue of not only the Abraham Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation, but you had, by virtue of this actual amendment, that applied to the country nationwide. Because then there was this big issue and it was so polarized and people were so entrenched in their positions that the South wanted to secede from the Union, right? They wanted to say, hey, we're going on our own. And this is the values that we have. And this is what we believe we should do. And this was the nature of our democracy and how we're going to run things. Well, again, history really answered that question, and it's obvious what occurred. So I don't need to speak about that. But what I do need to speak about is the history and how, you know what? It was polarizing then, and it just seems like we're really polarized in our politics now. Polarized with regard to, it's great to have Democrats and Republicans. And what happened to the times where you can have these debates over democracy and debates over what was the right policy to follow, and your enemy, right, was not your enemy. They were just your political opposition. Now they're your enemy, right? It was just you were politically opposed to me. It doesn't mean you're my enemy. But nowadays, wow, it has become so polarized. And it's just it reminded me, as I've studied history over the years, of just how really bad it's gotten. Don't mean to be about doom and gloom, but I do mean to be about facts. And we know, as a result of this 13th Amendment, of course, in the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude, there was, of course, the exception made in voluntary servitude for prisoners, because if you got locked up, that was a different story. But just by virtue of the nature of how we were going to live our life and how we were going to live our life as a joint country, as the United States of America, was to disregard a system that treated one group of people one way and another group of people another way. And so you had, by virtue of this 13th Amendment, that reality where, in effect, you were trying to get a United States of America. In effect, you were trying to get people on the same page. And in effect, you were trying to instill a value that was the respect of everyone, white, black, brown, etc. And I just can't help, as I look and I think about where we are now and about the United States Supreme Court, let me jump ahead just a minute, and how the United States Supreme Court wants to make us colorblind. We have a colorblind society. Everything is all good. There's been so many advancements and everything else. Well, I'll leave that to you to decide whether or not that's appropriate. Maybe some of you are saying, of course it is. That was years ago. And others of you are saying, nonsense. How is it that you subjugate a person for hundreds of years, hundreds of years, and then you say, well, now things okay. You've made appropriate strides. You've gone to good schools. You've gotten good jobs. You've gotten and made your money. And so we're going to forget about all that. And the current Supreme Court is going to say, it's a colorblind society. Don't you dare consider in admissions race. Don't you dare consider, as a corporation, anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Don't you dare consider, as it relates to voting rights and having people who are representatives who look like you, consider race in that at all. Let's forget about the past. Well, you can't forget about the past, because the past is some indicator of the future. And so as we dissect these parts, and I wanted to introduce you to where we're going, I started off by talking about the slavery and the issue of the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery that came for that. We are going to take a much deeper dive into the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then, of course, I just mentioned it, the Kalis decision, which was just decided in 2026, and how it eviscerates so much of our history, which is why I started with our history. This is part one. Make sure you tune in for part 2, 3, and 4. This is Joey Jackson on the law. May the law be with you. Welcome to Joey Jackson on the Law, where we are talking all things race and race relations and equal protection. Why? Because when we look now, we're seeing attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a nasty word, a dirty word. We're seeing universities, don't you dare consider race as it relates to admission. And by the way, you shouldn't consider as it relates to hiring anyone that has to do with that, because we're in a colorblind society. We're seeing it not only in higher education, we're seeing it in corporate America with regard to the dismantling of those programs, and we're seeing it with regard to voting. So what I want to talk about is the 14th Amendment. Now, let's talk about why that's significant. If you look back at Reconstruction and you look back at the Civil War, right, 1861 to 1865, if you look at the actual Union soldiers and the Confederacy and them fighting over the issue of slavery, ultimately there were 3 amendments passed as a result of the whole issues concerning the Civil War. I talked about one, right? You're going to have to watch that podcast, and that was the 13th Amendment in 1865. But today we're talking about another foundational amendment, and that's the 14th Amendment in 1868, just 3 years later. I think that amendment is so important because what you have is a current day Supreme Court that's applying that amendment. The court, as it's currently constituted, the Supreme Court consists of 9 justices. And of those 9 justices, you have 6 that are Republican, and you have actually 3 that happen to be Democrat. Why is that significant? It's significant because, I used to think when I went to law school that the law is the law. It doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, Martian, alien, green, yellow, black, white, Chinese, doesn't matter, right? The law is the law, and it's going to be interpreted that way by everyone. Boy, was I wrong. The fact is that people have different philosophies, and those philosophies lead to interpretations of different things and different events. Well, the issue is when you look at programs like diversity, equity, inclusion that allow us to be an inclusive society, that invite in people who are black, brown, and white, and yellow, and green, everybody, right? It wants to provide the opportunity that was lost for so many years. When you actually have endured hundreds of years of degradation, hundreds of years of being told your property, hundreds of years of being discriminated against, of being violated, of just completely being turned upside down, it might be nice to have a society that welcomes you, to try to give you a leg up since they tried to cut your legs off for so many years. And so what happened is born out of the issue of the Civil War was this 14th Amendment. And that 14th Amendment did a few things that are very important. Now, obviously, there's one that applies to birthright, right? People who are born and naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States are considered citizens, but it did more than that. The 14th Amendment also dealt with the issue not only of naturalization and birthright citizenship, but it dealt with the issue, a number of things, but I'll talk about 2 more. One is equal protection, and that's equal protection under the law. Get into that in 1 second. And another is due process, right? Can't take away life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And let's talk about that in the context of race, is what we're talking about now. When we look at specifically equal protection, what we're looking at is how everyone should be treated equally under the law. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone should be subjected, right, to the same rules under the law. Everyone should essentially be treated evenly and equally under the law. Well, the reason that you've had throughout the course of our history, although not anymore, you had these issues relating to affirmative action programs was, again, to give people a leg up who had been discriminated against for so long. The reason you had diversity, equity, and inclusion was to welcome a society that invited people in who were discriminated against for so long. The reason you had the issue of equal protection was to remind everyone, right, who felt they were entitled that, nope, you're not any better nor any worse than anyone else. And so that reading of equal protection over the course of time has transformed in different ways. Today, the way it's being looked at the Supreme Court is we are going to live in a colorblind society. And in fact, you're seeing instances of the attacks about reverse discrimination. Well, why didn't I get the job? Why did somebody else get it? Now, all of those are value judgments which everyone watching can make. Everyone has their opinions about whether it's proper and appropriate, whether diversity, equity, inclusion is good and bad. Today's society, it seems like, oh, it's the worst. You look at the Supreme Court of the United States, they're saying in a race neutral society, you can't evaluate any of that. But it's important when you look back at 1868, the basis of it was to make clear that people should not be discriminated against in any way, that everyone should be equal, that everyone should have the opportunity to have due process, which is notice and an opportunity to be heard before property or life or liberty was taken away from you. But it's important when you evaluate the current day attacks to look at the prior history and to understand why it was amendment with teeth, why it has value. Now, anything, to be clear, that is looked at under the structure of the 14th Amendment, if the state, meaning a governmental entity, is going to apply the 14th Amendment, they have to, if they're going to use race, have a very compelling reason as to why they're using race. And I guess the question for me is, would it not be compelling with these past instances of discrimination, with a society that has come a long, long way, to be clear, but certainly has a long way to go? And is it appropriate? It's an open question, that we forget about the past. We forget about the Civil War. We forget about prior instances of discrimination. We forget about poll taxes. Talk about that later. We'll forget about literacy tests. Talk about that later. And forgetting about all these discriminatory acts, everybody's equal now. We're going to ignore the past. We're going to treat everybody as if they're on one plane, and anything less would be uncivilized. You've heard that before. And so the issue really for me in looking at the 14th Amendment is what equal protection actually means. And in this current day and under the current Supreme Court, is that what we're getting? Is that the evaluation the Supreme Court is bringing to the party? Meaning, are you applying the law to get everyone's equal protection? Or is equal protection really not that equal? And are you taking away various rights from people under the guise of saying it's equal protection under the law? In any event, speaking of the law, this is Joey Jackson on the law. I'm Joey Jackson, and may the law be with you. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and press subscribe, and leave us a review in the comments.